Sensor Prime Othek Val had spent 40 years watching the dark, and in all that time the dark had never once surprised him. He sat in the high ring of the watchtower above the world of Maelrekt, where 10,000 screens burned a soft blue across his face. Each screen showed a slice of space. Each slice was counted, named, and owned. Nothing moved in the reach of the Concord that Othek did not see, and nothing he saw was ever allowed to live in secret. That was the whole law of his people. To be seen was to be known. To be known was to be held. There was no third door. The young ones called him the eye that does not blink. He let them. It was good for a watchmaster to wear a frightening name. It kept the apprentices honest, and honesty, in the watchtower, meant staring at a screen for a full shift without once looking away. Below him, in the deep ring, 300 lesser eyes worked the boards. They tracked every freighter, every drifting rock, every spark of heat in the 70 systems the Concord called its own. The Concord did not build the biggest guns in the galaxy. It did not need to. It built the best eyes. When you can see a war coming from 9 years away, you do not need to win the war. You simply make sure the war never reaches you. You meet it far out in the cold, already knowing its name, its weight, its weakness, and the exact second its heart will stop. The Concord had not lost a fight in 1100 years. People said this with awe. Othek said it the way you say a sum. It was not luck. It was arithmetic. You cannot lose a fight you have already finished in your head before the other side has finished arriving. So when the small contact appeared at the edge of his board that morning, Othek felt nothing at all. Not fear, not even interest. Only the dull pleasure of a man watching a number behave. It was a single ship. It came in slow along the trade lane from the human reach, the way 100 human ships came in every cycle, hauling ore and salt and bad music to sell to anyone who would buy. The contact was small. The mass read said 8,000 tons, a corvette at most. The heat bloom was weak. The hull shape, when the long eyes drew it, was plain and blunt and a little ugly, the way human metal always looked to him, like something hammered rather than grown. Othek tagged it, filed it, and forgot it. One more crumb drifting into the mouth of the Concord. He did not know its name yet. He would learn it. By the end of the day he would know it better than he knew his own. The ship was called the Hushed Lantern, and it had been built by a species the Concord had filed, long ago, under a single short word in the old tongue. The word meant loud. The humans were the loud ones. They shouted across the void in 1,000 languages. They sang on open channels. They sent their music and their arguments and their prayers blasting out in every direction. Careless, bright, impossible to miss. The Concord had a whole library wing devoted to recordings of human noise. To the eyes of Maelrekt, the humans were a people who could not stay hidden if their lives depended on it, and whose lives, increasingly, did. This was the joke the watchtower told. When an apprentice grew proud, a senior eye would pull up a clip of a human freighter crew singing badly into a hot mic, and the whole deep ring would laugh, and the proud one would learn his place. The humans, the species that could not whisper, the species that would never, ever learn to hide. So when the Hushed Lantern came in along the lane, no eye in the tower looked at it twice. It was loud after all. They could hear its drive humming. They could read its heat. They could see its blunt little hull. A loud ship is a safe ship. A loud ship is a counted ship. What none of the 300 eyes asked that morning was the only question that mattered. If the humans were truly the loud ones, who had taught the Concord to find them by sound? And if a thing could be taught to be loud, what else could it be taught to be? Captain Lena Brask sat in the dim heart of the Hushed Lantern and listened to an enemy laugh at her ship without knowing she was there. The laugh came through her own boards, pulled out of the Concord's chatter, and cleaned and turned into words she could read. The watchtower was talking. A senior eye had spotted the inbound corvette, made a joke about loud human metal, and the deep ring had laughed along. Brask read the joke twice. Then she let herself smile, just a little, in the dark. The Hushed Lantern was not a corvette. The 8,000 tons the Concord read was a lie her engineers had spent 9 years learning to tell. The weak heat bloom was a lie. The blunt, ugly hull was a lie wrapped around a shape the Concorde had never been allowed to measure. The bad human music leaking from her drive was a recording, looped, fed out on purpose, because Brask had learned the same thing Othik Val had built his life upon, and had learned it the other way around. The Concorde found ships by what they showed. So the hushed lantern had been built to show exactly, precisely, only what Brask wished the Concorde to see. She was the quietest thing humanity had ever made, and she had come a very long way to be underestimated. To understand why the Concorde could not see the hushed lantern, you have to understand what the Concorde was. The eyes of Maelrecht did not begin as a power, they began as prey. 1100 years before Othik Val was born, his people were a soft, slow species on a thin-aired world, and the galaxy around them was full of teeth. Hunters came in fast ships. Raiders took what they wanted. The early Maelrecht had no walls strong enough and no fleets large enough, and they were, for a long age, simply eaten. What saved them was not courage, it was watching. A people who are weak learn to look. They built towers and lenses and listening dishes. They learned to read a raider's drive wash from a system away and run before it arrived. They learned that you do not need to be strong if you are never where the strong thing strikes. And slowly, over centuries, they turned that desperate habit into a faith and then into an empire. They did not conquer their neighbors with guns. They conquered them with knowledge. They knew every raider's home port before the raider knew his own next move. They sold that knowledge, and then they hoarded it, and then they used it, and the teeth of the galaxy went dull against a people who could never be ambushed. By Othek's day, the faith had a single hard shape. The Concorde believed that the universe was, at bottom, a thing to be measured, and that anything which could be measured could be ruled, and that anything which could not be measured did not, in any way that counted, exist. They had pushed this belief so far that their war doctrine had no word for surprise. There was only data, and the lack of data, and the lack of data was simply a place you had not yet pointed an eye. This was their strength. Brask knew it was also the only door they had left unlocked. She had read their whole history on the long flight in. 9 years of dark and silence, the hushed lantern coasting cold along trade lanes, drive throttled to a whisper, while her small crew of 41 slept in shifts and studied the empire they were sailing toward. They knew the Concorde's hymns. They knew its watch codes. They knew the names of its sensor primes and the way each one liked to file a contact. They knew that the watchtower above Maelrecht laughed at human noise, and they had come, in part, to find out what that laughter was worth. But they had not come for a joke. The hushed lantern had come for 31,000 people the Concorde was about to kill, and did not yet know it would have to choose otherwise. The 31,000 lived on a small world called Cantrell, 3 jumps out from Maelrecht, at the soft edge of the Concorde's reach. Cantrell was a human colony, old and poor, 4 generations deep, a place of orchards under glass, and one tired city, and a single orbital dock that had not seen a warship in living memory. Cantrell had done nothing to the Concorde. Its only crime was where it sat. The Concorde was expanding its watch net, ring by ring, and Cantrell happened to lie across the next ring out. The eyes of Maelrecht did not allow blind spots inside their net. A world full of loud humans, with their unmeasured comings and goings, was a smudge on a clean lens. There was a thing the Concorde did with the worlds it cleared, and Brask had made her crew study it on the long flight, because she wanted them to understand exactly what they were sailing to stop. The eyes of Maelrecht did not think of themselves as killers. This was the part that the loud fleets of the human reach could never quite swallow. The Concorde kept careful records of every world it had wiped, and in those records there was no hatred, no triumph, not even much in the way of regret. There was only the language of cleaning. A world that lay across the watchnet was a smudge on the lens. A people whose comings and goings could not be fully measured were a source of noise, and noise, to the Concorde, was not a moral matter. It was a flaw in the instrument, and a flaw in the instrument was a thing you corrected, calmly, with the same hand you would use to wipe a fingerprint from glass. Brask had read the file on a world the Concorde had cleared 60 years before, a small mining moon at the edge of an earlier ring, and the file had haunted her all the way out. It was not the killing that haunted her, it was the tidiness. The Concorde had read the moon, counted its people, filed their number, and then removed them, and the closing line of the file said only this: "The lens is clean." There were 8,000 people behind that number, and the Concorde had not even bothered to hate them. It had simply found them inconvenient to its sight, and so it had switched them off, and gone back to watching. That was the empire that had filed Cantrell as a smudge, and that was why Brask had not come to bargain or to threaten in the ordinary way. You cannot bargain with an instrument. You cannot threaten a hand that feels no fear of the thing it wipes. The only way to stop the Concorde from cleaning Cantrell was to make the Concorde, for the first time in 1100 years, see itself as the smudge, to put the lens in front of a mirror, to make the hand that wiped worlds feel, for one cold morning, what it was like to be the thing under the cloth. She had thought about this a great deal, and she had decided it could not be done with words. The Concorde had heard every word in the galaxy. Doomed peoples had begged it, cursed it, reasoned with it, offered it everything they had. The files were full of their voices, neatly logged, and the Concorde had cleaned them all the same. Words were noise. The Concorde was very good at filing noise. The only language the eyes of Mailrect could not file was the language of a thing they could not measure, sitting in their lap, choosing not to kill them. That was the one sentence in the universe the Concorde had never heard, and Brask had built a ship 9 years in the making to speak it. The crew of the Hushed Lantern knew all this. It was why they could live 9 years in silence and not break. They were not hiding because they were afraid. They were hiding because the silence was the sentence, and the sentence was the only thing in the galaxy that could save 31,000 people who would never know they had been in danger. Every soft shoe, every baffled vent, every looped scrap of bad human music fed out to keep a watchtower laughing was a word in a sentence aimed at the one organ of the Concorde that had never been touched, which was its certainty. There was a young rating aboard, a boy of 20 named Hask Oren, on his first long flight, and somewhere out in the dark he had asked Corin Alt the question that the young always ask on the way to a thing like this. He had asked whether it would work, whether one ship, however clever, could really make the most all-seeing empire in the Reach call back a fleet, whether the silence was enough. Corin Alt, who had built half the ship's stealth with his own hands, had thought about it for a while before he answered, and what he said had passed around the crew the way the best things a steady man says always do. He said, "The Concorde has the best eyes in the galaxy," and that is exactly the problem. A man with the best eyes in the world stops listening for footsteps because he is sure he would see anyone coming. We are not coming where they can see. We are coming where they stopped listening. He said, "It works because they are good. A worse empire, a blind empire, would post guards and stay nervous. The Concorde cannot stay nervous because it cannot imagine being surprised. Their strength is the lock, and the lock is the door we walk through." He said, "The only people you can truly ambush are the ones who are certain they cannot be." Hask Oren had not asked again after that. He had gone quiet in the good way, the way a young person goes quiet when an old truth lands, and he had done his work in soft shoes like all the rest, and when the morning came that the singing rock dropped its coat over the watchtower of Mailrect, he had been at his post, and he had not been afraid, because he had understood for 11 days exactly why it would work. So the Concorde had filed an order. The order was not cruel, by the lights of the people who wrote it. It was tidy. A clearance fleet would arrive at Cantrell in 19 days, read the world, and remove it. Not bomb it in rage. Simply switch it off, the way you wipe a smear from glass, so the lens behind would be clean again. The 31,000 were a smudge. Smudges are wiped. Earth had learned of the order the way Earth learned most things now, by listening to an empire that never stopped talking about how well it could listen. The irony was not lost on the quiet fleet. The Concorde broadcast its own genius constantly. It could not help itself. A power built on seeing everything cannot resist announcing that it sees everything. And so the order to clear Cantrell had gone out across 100 Concorde channels, encrypted, but encrypted in a scheme the Quiet Fleet had cracked 4 years earlier, and had never once let the Concord suspect was broken. That was the whole secret of the war between the Loud Ones and the All-Seeing Ones. The Concord thought it watched the humans. The humans, in truth, had been watching the Watchers for a very long time, and had learned to do it without leaving a single fingerprint on the glass. Brask's orders had been simple to read and hard to carry. Reach Cantrell before the clearance fleet. Stand between 31,000 people and an empire that had not lost a fight in 1,100 years. Do it with one ship, and do it, if there was any way at all, without giving the Concord a true measure of what that ship could do, because a Concord that learned to see the hushed lantern would be a Concord that learned to kill the next one. She had 19 days. She had spent 11 of them already, creeping in along the trade lane, letting the watchtower file her as a corvette, letting them laugh. Now she was 4 hours out from Mailwrecked itself, and the clearance fleet was forming up in the high orbit above the watch world, 11 ships strong, waiting for the order to jump out to Cantrell and wipe it clean. Brask had not come to fight the clearance fleet out at Cantrell, where the killing would already be a race. She had come to meet it here, at home, in the one place the Concord believed nothing could ever reach it unseen. She had come to stand in the middle of the eye that does not blink, and ask it, very politely, to look down. The hushed lantern slid through the outer watch rings like a held breath. Othek Val, in his high chair, watched the corvette cross his board and felt the old smooth boredom of a man whose day is going exactly as the numbers promised. The contact behaved. It hauled along the lane at a freighter's pace. Its heat stayed weak. Its loud little drive sang its loud little song. He did not give it a second eye. He had a clearance fleet to dress, 11 ships to bless, with clean firing solutions. A smudge 3 jumps out to make ready to wipe. The Concord's confidence was not arrogance, exactly. Brask had thought about this carefully on the long flight. Arrogance is when you believe you are better than you are. The Concord was not wrong about itself. It really could see almost everything. Its eyes really were the finest in the Reach. Its arithmetic really had carried it unbeaten across 11 centuries. The flaw was not that the Concord overrated its sight. The flaw was that it had forgotten sight was a thing that could be answered. It had measured the galaxy for so long that it no longer believed the galaxy might be measuring it back. And so the eyes of Mailwrecked had grown, without ever noticing, into the most spectacular blind spot of all. They watched everything and suspected nothing, because in 1,100 years no one had ever managed to walk up to them unseen. Their guard was perfect against the thing they could detect. They had no guard at all against the thing they could not, because they did not believe such a thing could be. The hushed lantern was that thing, and she was, at this moment, 80,000 kilometers from the watchtower and closing, and not one of 300 eyes had so much as flinched. Inside the ship, the silence was a discipline so old it had become a way of life. The hushed lantern ran cold. Her crew moved in soft shoes. Her air pushed slow and quiet through baffled vents. Her hull drank heat, and hid it and bled it out the far side in directions no Concord eye was watching. Every system aboard had been built twice, once to do its job, and once to hide that the job was being done. 41 people lived inside a machine whose entire purpose was to be a hole in the universe where a warship should be. Lena Brask had captained the hushed lantern for 6 years. Before that she had flown loud ships, the ordinary bright warships of the Quiet Fleet's open arm, and she had been good at it, and she had hated the way the loud fleet fought. Loud fighting was trading. You showed your strength, the enemy showed his, and the side with more strength won, and the side with less strength died, and the math was honest and brutal and dull. Brask had wanted a different math. She had volunteered for the Quiet Arm the year it formed, and she had spent 6 years learning a kind of war the Concord did not have a word for, because the Concord had never once needed to be the one who could not see. Her first officer was a steady older man named Corin Alt, who had built half the Lantern's stealth systems with his own hands before he ever flew in her, and who trusted those systems the way a man trusts a bridge he poured himself. Her sensor chief was a young woman, barely 2 years out of the academy, named Pel Idris, who had the rare gift of listening to an enemy talk and hearing the shape of his fear underneath the words. It was Pell who had pulled the watchtower's laughter off the air and cleaned it for Brask to read. "They've filed us as freight," Pell said quietly, watching her board. "Low priority. The senior eye called us, and I'm translating loosely, a singing rock." "Good," Brask said. "Let them sing back." The plan was not complicated. The best plans rarely are. Complicated plans have too many places to break. Brask's plan had 3 parts, and she had drilled all 3 until her crew could run them in their sleep, which, on the long flight, several of them had. Part 1 was to be invisible, which they already were. Part 2 was to make the Concorde stop the clearance fleet without firing a shot, by showing the eyes of Malrect the one thing they had never, in 1100 years, been shown, which was their own blindness, up close, with their home in the crosshairs. Part 3 was to leave without teaching them how the trick was done. Part 3 was the hard one. Anyone can frighten an empire. Frightening an empire is loud work, and loud work teaches the enemy things. Brask had to frighten the Concorde so completely that it would call back its clearance fleet and leave Cantrell alone, and she had to do it while giving the eyes nothing, no true reading, no measurement, no clean look at the hushed lantern that they could study and learn to counter. She had to be the most terrifying thing the watchtower had ever seen and, at the same time, a thing they could never afterward describe. She had thought, on the long dark flight, about how a ghost works. A ghost frightens you not because it is strong, but because it breaks the one rule you were sure of. The Concorde's one sure rule was that nothing reaches Malrect unseen. Brask did not need to be stronger than the Concorde. She needed to be a ghost, exactly once, in front of the right eyes, at the right range, holding the right city in her hands. "Range to the watchtower," she said. 61,000, Pell answered. "We could be there in 20 minutes at lane speed. Faster if we burn." "We won't burn." Burning was loud. Burning was a measurement. Lane speed. Let them keep counting us as a rock. Corin Alt leaned over the firing board, his big hands resting on it the way a man rests his hands on something he loves. "Weapons are cold and quiet," he said. "Spinal mount is loaded. Lateral batteries are loaded. Decoy hulls are racked and ready. We can go from silent to a full picture in 9 seconds. He paused. "Or we can go from silent to one clean shot in 3. "Hold everything," Brask said. "We don't fire first. We don't fire at all if I can help it. The whole point is that they call it off because they understand, not because we bleed them. A frightened empire that learned nothing is a problem solved. A bleeding empire that learned how we did it is a problem that comes back with new eyes." She watched the watchtower grow on her screen, a vast pale ring above a vast pale world, 10,000 windows lit blue, the proudest eye in the galaxy, blind to the small dark thing drifting up into its lap. "Pell," she said, "when we decloak, I want their own watch codes. I want to come up speaking their language, on their channels, with their own authority stamps. I don't want them to wonder if it's a trick. I want them to know, in the first half second, that we were always already inside." Pell's hands were already moving. "That's the cruelest thing we've built," she said, not as a complaint. "We're going to tell them we belong here." "Yes," Brask said, "because to a people who believe being seen is the whole law, the worst thing in the universe isn't a gun. It's a thing they cannot file. We are going to walk into the middle of the eye that does not blink, and we are going to be the one fact it cannot measure, and we are going to do it while its home hangs under our spinal mount." She let out a slow breath. "And then, if they're wise, they'll call back their fleet, and we'll go home, and Cantrell will keep its orchards, and the Concorde will spend 100 years afraid of a ship they were never able to see." "And if they're not wise?" Corin asked. Brask looked at the firing board, at the spinal mount loaded and cold and patient. "Then they'll learn the loud lesson instead," she said. "But I'd rather they didn't. I came a long way to scare them, not to teach them what's coming." On the watchtower, Othik Val finished blessing the clearance fleet. 11 ships, dressed and ready, their firing solutions clean, their jump charts laid in. In 19 hours they would leap out to the smudge called Cantrell and wipe it from the lens, and the watchnet would grow one ring cleaner, and Othek would file the action and forget it, the way he had filed and forgotten 10,000 actions across 40 years. He stretched in his high chair. The singing rock had reached 50,000 kilometers, still hauling along the lane, still loud, still nothing. He noted it without thinking. A man does not think about a thing his whole life has trained him to ignore. The thought that should have come to him, and did not, was a very small thought, the kind the watchtower had drilled out of its eyes generations ago because it had never once been useful. The thought was this. In 40 years of watching the dark, every single thing Othek Val had ever seen had behaved exactly as its measurement promised. Not once had the dark surprised him, and a man who is never surprised stops asking whether the dark is empty or whether it has simply learned what he is looking for and learned to be the shape of nothing in his eyes. The singing rock crossed 40,000 kilometers. Othek did not look up. The hushed lantern crossed 30,000 kilometers, and Lena Brask gave the order in a voice no louder than a person asking for the time. "Bring us up," she said. "All of it. Watch codes first." What happened next took 3 seconds, and the Concorde would study those 3 seconds for the rest of its long history. The hushed lantern did not roar. It did not flare. A loud ship announces itself with fire, a great burn of drive and a blaze of weapons coming online, and the Concorde knew how to read that announcement and would have read it from a system away. The lantern did the opposite. It simply stopped lying. All at once, every system that had spent 9 years pretending to be small stopped pretending. The false heat bloom fell away. The looped human music cut to silence. The blunt, ugly hull shape, which had been a skin of baffles and shaped plate over the true vessel, shed its disguise in the eyes of the watchtower like a coat dropped to the floor. And the singing rock the Concorde had filed as 8,000 tons of freight became, in the space of 3 heartbeats, 90,000 tons of human warship, a long dark blade of a thing bristling with batteries, its spinal mount a single vast line down its spine, and that line pointed, with the patience of a thing that had been pointed for an hour already, directly at the watchtower of Mailwrecked. In the deep ring, an apprentice eye named Cello screamed. He did not mean to. He was 19, 3 months on the boards, and he had been idly watching the freight contact because the senior eyes had told him to keep one screen on the lane and learn to count rocks. He was counting the rock when the rock unfolded. The number on his board went from 8,000 to 90,000 in less time than it took to read it. The shape on his screen grew teeth. And the range that had been a safe and sleepy 40,000, was now 30,000, and inside the inner watch ring, inside the line the Concorde had drawn 1,100 years ago and never once seen crossed, inside the place where nothing, by the whole law of his people, was ever allowed to be. Cello screamed, and 300 eyes looked up, and the watchtower of Mailwrecked learned, all together, in one cold instant, what fear was. Othek Val did not scream. He had 40 years of discipline holding his throat shut. But he came up out of his high chair so fast that his old joints cried out, and he stood there, gripping the rail of the watch ring, staring at a board that had betrayed everything he believed, and for the first time in his long life, the dark had surprised him. The warship sat in his lap. It had not jumped in. There was no jump flash on the record, no drive flare, no breach of the watchnet's outer rings that any of his 300 eyes had caught. He scrolled the record back, his hands shaking, and there it was, the proof and the horror of it. The ship had not appeared. The ship had always been there. It had come in slow along the lane, in plain sight for 11 days, and his tower had looked straight at it the whole time and seen a singing rock, because the ship had shown them a singing rock, and the Concorde's whole genius was that it believed what it saw. He had blessed a clearance fleet that morning with a warship at his throat, and had laughed at it for being loud. Then the channels lit, and it got worse. The human ship was speaking, not on a warband, not in the human tongue, not as an enemy hailing from outside. It was speaking on the Concorde's own watch codes, the private channels of the tower itself, the inner authority stamps that only a sensor prime was supposed to hold. The warship came up onto Othic's own line, inside his own house, wearing his own keys, and the voice that spoke was calm and human and entirely without hurry. "Watchtower of Malrect," the voice said, in clean Concord speech. "This is the warship, hushed lantern of the Terran Quiet Fleet. We have been inside your net for 11 days. We have been inside your inner ring for 40 minutes. Our spinal mount has held a firing solution on your tower for the last 12. We have not fired. We do not wish to. Please understand that everything that happens next is your choice, not ours." In the deep ring, the eyes were shouting now, hands flying over boards, every system in the tower clawing for a measurement of the thing in their lap. And here was the second horror, the one that turned Othic's old blood to water. They could not get one. They could see the warship. Of course they could see it now. It was 30,000 kilometers away and the size of a city. But every tool they turned on it to measure it, to read its drive, to count its guns, to learn the one thing the Concorde lived on, the true number behind the thing, came back wrong. The lantern bled false readings the way it had bled false silence. Its hull threw their scans into noise. Its drive read as 4 different masses at once. When the eyes tried to count its weapons, the count changed every time they looked. The warship let itself be seen, and it let itself be feared, and it gave the eyes of Malrect not one single clean fact to file. To anyone else this would have been a small thing. To the Concorde it was the end of the world. A people whose entire faith was that to be seen is to be known, had been shown a thing they could see and could not know. The third door, the door their whole law swore did not exist, had just opened in the middle of their own house, and a warship had walked through it. For a long moment, the deep ring of the watchtower simply did not believe its own boards. This was not stupidity. It was the opposite. The eyes of Malrect were the best-trained sensor crews in the Reach, and they had been trained, above all else, to trust the instrument. A watchmaster who doubted his own readings was a watchmaster who would freeze at the wrong moment and let a true threat slip past while he second-guessed a ghost. So the Concorde drilled doubt out of its eyes the way an army drills fear out of soldiers. The board says it. The board is true. Act on the board. That discipline had carried them unbeaten across 1100 years, and now that same discipline turned on them like a blade reversed in the hand. The board had said the contact was a singing rock, and they had trusted the board, because trusting the board was the whole law. The board had been wrong, not by a little but by an order of magnitude. 8,000 tons that were 90,000, a freighter that was a warship, a thing in the lane that was a thing in the lap. The very habit that made them great had made them blind, because a people who never doubt their instrument are a people who can be killed with a lie told to the instrument, and the humans had told the loudest lie in the galaxy in a whisper, and the instrument had repeated it back as truth for 11 days running. An older eye in the deep ring, a woman who had watched the boards for 30 years, said aloud the thing none of them wanted to say. She said, "If the board was wrong about this, then how do we know the board is right about anything?" She gestured at the great wall of screens. 10,000 contacts across 70 systems, everyone filed and named and trusted. How many of those, she asked, are singing rocks? How many warships are we filing as freight right now, across the whole Reach, because they have shown us what we expect? The question hung in the air and no one answered it, because there was no answer, because the honest answer was that they could not know, and would never again be able to know, and that single unanswerable question was the wound the human ship had come to open. Othic Vol heard her, and did not silence her, though a younger Othic would have. He understood that she had named the true catastrophe. It was not the one warship in his lap. It was every ship the board had ever shown him. The hushed lantern had not merely fooled the watchtower once. It had proven that the watchtower was foolable, and a watchtower that can be fooled is a watchtower that can never again be certain of a single contact for as long as it watches the dark. The Concorde had not lost a fight in 1100 years because it always knew what was coming. From this morning forward it would always wonder. And an empire that always wonders is no longer the eyes of Malrect. It is only a frightened people with very good lenses, staring at a dark that has learned to lie to them. The boards filled with the work of 300 eyes, all trying at once to do the one thing they had built their lives upon. They turned every tool the Concorde owned on the dark blade in the inner ring and tried to measure it. They threw long eyes and deep scans and mass reads and heat counts, the finest sensor craft 11 centuries had produced, all of it at once, at a single ship 30,000 kilometers away and the size of a city, and the dark blade gave them back exactly as much truth as it chose, which was none. The mass read said 90,000 tons, then 40, then 110, then nothing at all. The heat count found a drive signature and lost it, and found 3 more in places the first could not have moved to. The long eyes drew a hull, and the hull's edges blurred and doubled and would not hold still long enough to be filed. Every instrument in the watchtower agreed on a single fact, and only a single fact, that there was a warship there, and beyond that fact each instrument told a different lie, because the warship was feeding each of them a different lie on purpose, the way a hand held in front of many mirrors shows a different shape in each. To the eyes of Malrect, this was a horror with no name in their language. They had a word for an enemy they could not yet measure, a thing simply not yet looked at hard enough. They had no word at all for a thing they were looking at as hard as they could and still could not measure, because in 1100 years no such thing had existed. The humans had built the word made flesh, a ship you could see and could not know, a fact you could stare at and could not file. The third door their whole faith swore did not exist, standing open in the middle of their home, with a warship in the gap, holding fire, asking them to choose. Othik Val found his voice. He keyed his line, and he spoke to the thing in his lap, and he hated that his voice was not steady. "How long," he said, "how long have you been able to do this?" There was a pause. When the human voice answered, it was almost gentle. "A while," Brask said. "You taught us, in a way. You spent 1100 years showing the whole galaxy exactly what you could see and exactly how. You could not help it. A power built on watching cannot stop announcing how well it watches. So we listened. We learned the shape of your eyes, and then we built a ship that is the shape of nothing in them." Another pause. "You were never wrong about your sight, Sensor Prime. Your eyes really are the best in the reach. We just stopped letting them be the only thing that's true." Othik closed his own eyes. Behind the lids he saw 40 years of boards, 10,000 contacts, every one of them filed and tidy and obeying its measurement, and he understood, with a grief that surprised him, that he had no way at all of knowing how many of them had been real. That was the cruelty of it. Not that this one ship had fooled him, that every ship might have. The Concorde's confidence had rested on a single unspoken promise, that the dark held only what the eyes could find. The hushed lantern had not broken that promise loudly. It had simply proven once, at the worst possible range, that the promise had never been true, and a promise that has been false once is false forever after. Every future contact the Concorde ever filed would now carry a small, cold question underneath it. Is this the true shape of the thing, or only the shape it has chosen to let me see? A people who can never again trust their own eyes are a people who can never again be sure they have won. Brask had not come to kill the Concorde. She had come to take from it the one thing it could not live without, which was the certainty that it could not be surprised. And she had done it without firing a shot. But the clearance fleet still hung in high orbit. 11 ships, dressed and blessed, jump charts laid for Cantrell. The order to wipe 31,000 people had not been called back. It had only been forgotten, for 3 seconds, in the shock of the unfolding. And Othik Val, even broken, even grieving, was still a Sensor Prime of the Concorde, and his mind, trained by 40 years to find the move, found it. The human ship had not fired. The human ship was begging him, in effect, to make the wise choice. That meant the human ship wanted very badly not to fight. And a thing that wants very badly not to fight, Othik reasoned, might be a thing that cannot. Perhaps the trick was all it had. Perhaps the lantern was a ghost with an empty gun, a thing built to frighten because it could not kill. The false readings could be hiding strength, yes, but they could also be hiding weakness. A clever bluff and a real threat look exactly the same to an eye that cannot measure either. For the first time in 1100 years, the Concord had to make a decision blind. And the terrible habit of a people who had never lost made Othik reach, in his fear, for the answer that had always served them. When in doubt, the Concord struck the unknown thing down before it could grow. A smudge is wiped. A blind spot is filled with fire. All eyes, Othik said, his voice hardening. Give the clearance fleet a solution on the human ship. 11 hulls. Bring them about. He stared at the unmeasurable thing in his lap, and he made the oldest mistake his people had, which was to believe that a thing he could not measure could therefore be overpowered with enough that he could. We do not negotiate with a ghost. We turn on the lights. Fire. In the high orbit above Maelrekt, 11 Concord warships turned their guns toward the dark blade in the inner ring, and prepared to teach the loud humans the only lesson the Concord knew how to give. Aboard the hushed lantern, Pel Idris read the 11 solutions blooming on her board and said, very softly, they chose the loud lesson. Lena Brask did not look angry. She looked tired, and a little sad, the way a person looks when someone they warned does the foolish thing anyway. Yes, she said, they did. She settled back into her chair. All right, we don't teach them how, but we are going to teach them what. She keyed the open line one more time, the Concord's own watch codes, so that every eye in the tower would hear it. Sensor Prime, she said, I ask you to make this your choice, and you have. Watch closely. You've never been able to. I think you should see this one with your own eyes. She turned to Corin Alt, who had been waiting at the firing board with his big patient hands. Wake her up, Brask said, all the way. Show them the loud part. The hushed lantern had spent 9 years being quiet, so that this moment could be brief. Othik Val had given the order to fire, and the 11 ships of the clearance fleet were the finest the Concord built, fast and well-eyed and crewed by people who had never lost. By the cold arithmetic Othik had trusted his whole life, 11 against 1 was not a fight, it was a sum. 11 hulls, each as large as the human ship, each with clean firing solutions, against a single vessel, 30,000 kilometers deep in hostile space with nowhere to run. The numbers said the human ship would die in the first minute, and Othik, even broken, even afraid, took a small bitter comfort in the numbers, because numbers were the one thing he had left. The numbers were about to teach him their last and hardest lesson, which was that a number is only as good as the eye that takes it, and his eyes had been lying to him all morning. When the clearance fleet fired, it fired at the hushed lantern. It fired at where the reading said the lantern was, at the mass and the silhouette and the heat shape the fleet's own eyes had drawn. But those readings were the lantern's, given on purpose, and the lantern had given the fleet a target that was 30 kilometers from where the warship truly sat, a ghost image painted in the dark by the same craft that had painted a singing rock. 11 warships poured fire into an empty stretch of space and lit up nothing, while the real hushed lantern, dark and silent and unmeasured, was already moving. This was the part the Concord could never have planned for, because it had never once had to fight a thing it could not see. The whole doctrine of the Eyes of Maelrekt was to meet the enemy with knowledge, to have the firing solution before the enemy arrived, to finish the war in the head before it reached the body. But you cannot finish a war in your head against a ship that hands you the wrong head to finish it in. The Concord's 11 crews were the best trained gunners in the Reach, and they were, for the first time in 1100 years, firing blind, and they did not even know it, because their board still showed them a clean, confident target sitting exactly where they had shot. The hushed lantern answered. She did not answer the way a loud ship answers, with everything at once in a blaze. Brask fought the way she had always wanted to fight, the way the quiet arm had been built for, which was to make every shot a thing the enemy could not see coming and could not understand after it landed. The lantern's spinal mount spoke once, a single line of light down its long spine, and the lead ship of the clearance fleet, the flagship, the one that carried the fleet master who had laid the 11 solutions, came apart along its keel as cleanly as a fruit cut with a sharp knife. There was no flare of building power before the shot. There was no warning bloom on any Concorde board. The flagship was whole, and then the flagship was two pieces drifting apart, and the eye that should have read the shot coming had read nothing at all, because the lantern fired the way it sailed, cold and quiet and already done before you knew it had begun. HFY watched the flagship die on his board, and felt the last of his certainty go with it. He had given the order to fire on a ghost, believing the ghost might be bluffing, believing the trick might be all the human ship had. He understood now, far too late, that the trick had never been the weapon. The trick was only the door. The weapon was behind it, and the weapon was real, and it was loose inside the inner ring of Mailwrecked. The clearance fleet, to its credit, did not break. Concorde crews were brave. They had simply never needed bravery before, and now they reached for it all at once. The 10 surviving ships scattered into a defensive sphere and turned every eye they had on the dark, sweeping hunting, trying to find the thing that had killed their flagship. They were good. In any other fight they would have found the enemy and traded fire, and the better fleet would have won. But they were not in any other fight. They were in a fight against the one ship in the galaxy, built so that the finest eyes in the Reach could not find it, and the more they swept, the more ghost images the lantern fed them, until each of the 10 ships saw the human warship in a different place, and several saw it in 3 places at once, and the defensive sphere began to fire at shadows, and twice, in the chaos, fired at each other. Brask did not waste the gift. She moved through the panicking sphere like a knife through smoke, never where they looked, always where they did not, and the spinal mount spoke again, and a second Concorde ship folded. Then she came up the blind flank of a third, while it was busy shooting at a ghost, and the lateral batteries opened for the first and only time in the battle, a short, brutal rake along the ship's spine, and the third ship died. The lantern did not linger over any kill. She killed and was gone and was somewhere else before the readings caught up, and the readings never caught up, because the readings were hers. The fourth kill was the one the watchtower would replay the most, because it was the one that finally made them understand they were not fighting a ship at all, but a kind of darkness with teeth. By then 3 of the 11 were already wreckage, and the 7 survivors had drawn into a tight defensive knot, hulls almost touching, every gun facing out, every eye sweeping, the formation a frightened animal makes when it cannot tell where the predator is, and so guards every direction at once. It was a sound formation. Against any loud enemy it would have worked. The 7 would have caught the attacker in a crossfire the moment it committed, and traded fire, and the better armored side would have won, and the math would have been honest. But the hushed lantern did not commit, because committing was a measurement, and Brask did not give measurements. She came in along the one approach the knot of ships could not cover, which was no approach at all, drifting cold between 2 of the survivors, close enough that a crewman might have seen her hull with his own eyes, if he had been looking out a window instead of at a board, and the boards showed nothing, because the boards showed what the lantern told them, and the lantern told them she was 400 kilometers away and closing from the far side. The 7 turned their guns to the far side. The hushed lantern was already inside the knot. The spinal mount spoke from point-blank range, from inside the formation, and the shot went through one survivor and into a second behind it, and both came apart, and the watchtower watched 2 of its finest warships die from a shot that had come from the middle of its own defensive sphere, from a place the board swore was empty, fired by a thing that the board swore was 400 kilometers away. That was the 4th kill, and the 5th came with it as a gift, 2 hulls for 1 shot, and it was after the 4th and 5th that the surviving crews stopped trying to fight the human ship and started, simply, trying to live. This was the thing the Concorde had never understood about a war against a thing it could not see, because it had never had to. The eyes of Mailwrecked had spent 1100 years making sure that they always struck the enemy where the enemy was weakest, at the place and moment of their own choosing, with the firing solution already in hand. They had built an entire civilization around the certainty of the first shot, and now, for the first time, they were on the other side of that certainty. They were the ones who could not choose the place. They were the ones with no solution. They were the loud, bright, measurable thing, and the dark around them was the thing that chose, and the dark chose patiently, one ship at a time, in the order it preferred, and there was nothing in 11 centuries of doctrine that told a Concorde crew how to fight an enemy that had made them into the prey their ancestors had been before the towers were ever built. Othek Val watched the 4th and 5th ships die together and felt the whole shape of his people's history bend back on itself. The Concorde had begun as prey, soft, slow, eaten in the dark by things faster and crueler than themselves. They had built the towers and the lenses and the watching faith precisely so that they would never be prey again, so that they would always be the eye in the dark and never the thing the eye hunted. 1100 years of that, and one human ship had reached into the heart of it and turned them back into exactly what they had fled. He was watching his people be hunted in their own home, by a thing they could not see, and he understood, with a grief too large for his old chest, that the humans had not done this by becoming crueler than the Concorde, or stronger, or by hating them more. They had done it by becoming, deliberately, the thing the Concorde had spent its whole history making sure it would never have to face. They had become the dark that the eye cannot pierce. And against the dark that the eye cannot pierce, the best eyes in the reach were worth precisely nothing. It was then, with 5 of his ships dead, and the survivors firing at shadows and twice at each other, that Othek Val gave the order to call them off, and reached, in his fear, for the home guard he still believed was hidden. It was then that he made the last gambit of a man who could not yet accept that there was no card left to play, and it was then that the human voice had come up on his own watch codes, calm and unhurried, and offered him the strangest mercy in the galaxy, which was the chance to lose, and live, and learn, and carry the lesson home. In the watchtower, the deep ring had stopped shouting. There is a kind of fear that makes people loud, and a deeper kind that makes them silent, and the 300 eyes had passed from the first into the second. They watched their own clearance fleet, the unbeaten fleet, the proudest steel of an unbeaten people, come apart in the inner ring of their own home, and they could not even see the thing that was killing it. They could only see the dying. They watched ships die in the order the human warship chose, at the pace the human warship chose, and there was nothing in 1100 years of doctrine that told them what to do, because the doctrine had only one rule underneath all its rules, and the rule was see first. They could not see. The rule was broken, and without it they were exactly what their ancestors had been before the towers and the lenses, which was a soft, slow people in the dark, being eaten. Othek Val keyed his line. His hands had stopped shaking. There is a calm on the far side of terror, when a person has lost so much that there is little left to protect, and Othek had reached it. "Stop," he said, on the open channel, in the human ship's own clean Concorde speech. "I am calling them off. Hushed lantern, I am calling off the fleet. Please, stop." Brask's voice came back at once. She had been waiting for it. "Order them to hold fire and go cold," she said. "All of them. Drives down, guns down, eyes down. Do it now, and I will not fire again." Othek did it. He gave the order across the tower's own bands, and the 7 surviving ships of the clearance fleet, what was left of the 11, powered down their guns and killed their drives and went dark in the high orbit, and the killing stopped. For a long moment there was only silence in the inner ring of Maelrekt, the silence of a people who had learned, all at once, that they were not what they had believed themselves to be. Then Othek spoke again, quietly, and his question was not a war question. It was the question of a man who has spent his life building one thing and has just watched it prove hollow. "Why did you stop?" he said. "You had us. You could have finished the fleet. You could have killed the tower. You held a solution on us for 12 minutes before you ever spoke. Why are 7 of my ships still alive? Why am I still alive?" Aboard the hushed lantern, Lena Brask was quiet for a moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice was not the voice of a victor. It was the voice of someone explaining a thing she wished the other person had understood before so many had to die for it. "Because I did not come here to kill your fleet, Censor Prime," she said. "I came here to stop it killing 31,000 people on a world called Cantrell, which your Concorde filed as a smudge. I came to make you call that order back. The 4 ships I destroyed because you chose to fire, and once steel is loose, I do not lose the ships behind me to your pride. But I never wanted the 4. I want the 7. I want you. I want the tower." She paused. "Loud fleets fight to win. The quiet arm fights to stop. There is a difference, and your people have never had to learn it, because you have always been the ones who could not be reached. You can be reached. I am the proof. Now reach back, or don't, and we will both find out together what kind of people you are." Othik Val looked out at the dark blade he still could not measure, holding fire over the wreckage of his pride, and he understood that he was being offered something he had no doctrine for. Not defeat. The Concord had a place for defeat in theory, though it had never used it. This was stranger. He was being offered the chance to lose and live, to be spared by the thing that had broken him, and to carry what he had learned home into the heart of an empire that did not want to hear it. "You want me to call back the order on Cantrell?" he said slowly. "Yes," Brask said. "And then you will leave." "Yes. And in exchange, you give me back 7 ships and a tower and my life, and ask nothing else." "I ask one thing else," Brask said. "I ask that you remember this exactly as it happened. Not the way the Concord will want to file it, the way it was. A human ship walked into the middle of your eyes, and your eyes were the best in the reach, and they saw nothing, because seeing is not the same as knowing, and your people forgot the difference a long time ago. Remember that. Tell it true. That is the whole price." Othek Val was a sensor prime of the Concord, the eye that does not blink, 40 years a watcher of the dark. He had been certain, that morning, of everything. He was certain of nothing now, and he was old enough to know that this might be the most useful thing that had ever happened to him. "Pull up the Cantrell order," he said to the deep ring, and his voice did not shake at all. "Rescind it. Send the recall to the staging point on my authority. Top stamp. No delay. The smudge stands." The smudge was never a smudge. He looked back at the unmeasurable thing in his lap. "Log it as a watch error. Log that the tower was reached. Do not clean the record." He drew a breath. "Let them all see it. We are done pretending we cannot be surprised." There was a second fleet, and Othik Val had not told the human ship about it, because for a long, terrible hour he had meant to use it. The clearance fleet had been 11 ships, and 7 of those now hung dark and powered down in the high orbit, beaten without ever having found the thing that beat them. But the watch world of Malrect was the heart of the Concord, and the heart of an empire does not keep only one fleet. There was a home guard, the Inner Veil, 30 warships of the oldest and proudest line in the Reach, held in reserve behind the second watch ring, and the Inner Veil had not fired a shot, because the Inner Veil had been waiting, on Othek's silent order, for the moment the human ship gave them a true reading to shoot at. That had been the whole shape of Othek's last gambit, in the worst hour, before the sparing. He had called the clearance fleet off not out of mercy, but out of arithmetic. The clearance fleet was firing blind and dying for it. The Inner Veil, 30 strong, would not fire until the human ship showed its hand, until it committed to a real position to take a real shot, and in that one instant, the instant the ghost became a thing with a place, 30 of the finest guns in the Concord would fall on it all at once. Othik had powered down the clearance fleet to make the human captain believe she had won, to make her relax, to make her stop weaving ghosts and simply sit, so that the Inner Veil could finally see her. He had been, in that hour, still the eye that does not blink, still certain that patience and numbers, and the best sight in the Reach, would, in the end, find the unfindable thing and end it. The sparing, the recall, the talk of remembering, all of it had been laid over a hook, and the hook was 30 warships waiting in the dark for the human ship to make itself real. And the human ship had known. Brask had known about the Inner Veil before she ever decloaked. She had known because the Concord could not help itself, because a power built on watching cannot stop announcing how well it watches, and somewhere in 1100 years of broadcast pride, the Concord had logged the existence of its home guard. its readiness, its doctrine of the held reserve, and the quiet fleet had read it and filed it the way it filed everything. When Othic powered down the clearance fleet and spoke of mercy and asked why he was still alive, Brask had heard the second fleet in his voice, the way Pel Idris heard fear under words. She had heard a man being patient, and patience, from a man who had just lost, meant a man who had not finished losing in his own head. So she had let him have his hour. She had spoken of Cantrell and choice and remembering, all of it true, every word of it true, and she had also, while she spoke, never once given the inner veil the real reading it was waiting for. She had kept weaving ghosts, even through the talk of peace. She had let Othic believe she had relaxed, while she had not relaxed at all, and when the recall to Cantrell finally went out, top stamp, real and clean and logged, she had keyed the open line one last time, on the Concorde's own watch codes, so that every eye in the tower and every gun of the inner veil behind the second ring would hear it. "Sensor Prime," she had said, gently, "your home guard can stand down now too. The 30 behind the second ring, the inner veil, they have been waiting for me to make myself real, so they could fire. I am not going to. I was never going to. I want you to understand that I have known they were there since before I dropped my coat over your tower, and I let you keep them, because a frightened man should be allowed to keep one card he thinks I cannot see. But the card was always face up to me. Stand them down. The fight is over. It was over before it began." In the watchtower, the silence that followed was the deepest of the whole morning. Othic Val had built his entire last gambit on the one thing he was still sure of, that the human ship could not see his hidden fleet, that there remained one corner of his house the ghost had not entered, and the ghost had just told him, kindly, by name, that it had been standing in that corner too the whole time. There was no card left. There had never been a card. The eyes of Malrect had been outseen at the one thing they had believed no one in the galaxy could do, completely, down to the last hidden reserve, and the human captain had let him keep the illusion of a secret, only so that he could feel, when it fell, exactly how total the seeing had been. That was the moment Othic Val stopped fighting in his head, not when the flagship died, not when the clearance fleet went dark, when a calm human voice named the fleet he had hidden in his own home and told him, without triumph, that it had always been visible. A man can keep fighting as long as he believes there is one thing the enemy has not seen. Brask had taken that from him last, on purpose, gently, the way you take a weapon from someone you do not intend to kill. He had given the order then, and meant it for the first time. He had stood the inner veil down. 30 warships behind the second ring, the proudest line in the Reach, powered their guns to cold and never fired, and the watchtower of Malrect surrendered the last secret it had, and with it, the last of the certainty that had carried the Concorde unbeaten across 1100 years. He understood, sitting there in the wreckage of everything he had believed, that this was why he was still alive, and why his ships were still alive, and why a human warship that could have ended his world was instead asking him to remember. The human captain had not wanted to win. Winning was loud. She had wanted him to know, all the way down, with no card left to hide behind, that he had been seen and spared by a thing he could never see. A people who learns that lesson and lives is a people who might, in time, become something better than an instrument that wipes worlds. That was the gift. It looked exactly like a defeat, and it was the most generous thing that had ever happened to the eyes of Malrect, and Othic Val was old enough, by the end of that morning, to know the difference. The recall order went out from the watchtower of Malrect 11 minutes later, and Pel Idris read it off the Concorde's own bands before the tower ever told the hushed lantern it was done. "It's real," she said. "Top stamp, Othic's authority, sent clear to the staging point. The clearance fleet's standing order on Cantrell is rescinded. There's a follow line behind it." She looked up. He logged it the way he said he would. Watch error. Tower reached. He told them not to clean the record. Lena Brask let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 9 years. Somewhere 3 jumps out, a small poor world of orchards under glass and one tired city, would wake tomorrow and not know that the order to wipe it had ever existed, or that it had been called back, or that a single dark ship had crept into the lap of the most all-seeing empire, in the Reach, and bought 31,000 lives without spilling a drop of their blood. Cantrell would never know. That was, Brask thought, exactly as it should be. The best work the Quiet Arm ever did was the work no one could see, including the people it saved. But the job was not finished. Part 1 had been to be invisible, and they had been. Part 2 had been to make the Concorde stop the fleet without a true fight, and they had, near enough. Part 3 was the hard one, the one Brask had thought about for 9 years in the dark. Part 3 was to leave without teaching the Concorde how the trick was done. And Part 3 was not done yet, because the hushed lantern still hung in the inner ring of Malrect, 30,000 kilometers from 300 eyes that were now studying her with all the desperate attention of a people who had just learned they could be blind. The Concorde would never get a better chance to learn the lantern than right now. Every eye in the tower was on her. Every tool the Concorde had was trained on the dark blade in their lap. They could not measure her, no, the false reading still held. But they were watching how she moved, how she held position, the rhythm of her silence, hunting for any thread they could pull, any pattern they could file, anything at all that would let them say, next time, ah, there, that is the shape of a human ghost, we know it now. And if they found even one thread, then the next hushed lantern, and there would be a next, would sail into a Concorde that had learned to see her, and that ship and its 41 would die in the dark, and no one would ever know why. So Brask did the last and most patient thing. She gave them nothing to learn from by leaving the way she had arrived, which was as a thing that was never quite there. Take us out cold, she said. No burn. We came in as a singing rock. We leave as less than that. I want every eye in that tower to spend the next 100 years arguing about whether we were ever really here at all. The hushed lantern did not turn and run. Running is loud. Running is a measurement, a vector, a rhythm an eye can learn. The lantern simply began, very slowly, to stop being where the Concorde could see her. She fed the watchtower a last gift of false readings, a slow drift of ghost images peeling off in 6 directions at once, so that the 300 eyes saw the human warship leaving along 6 different headings, and could not say which was true, and in time came to suspect that none of them were. Her drive went from a whisper to a held breath to nothing. Her false heat fell away into the cold of the void. The dark blade in the lap of Malrect thinned and faded and unraveled in the eyes of the watchers, not the way a ship leaves, but the way a doubt leaves, slowly, never quite resolved, leaving behind the awful suspicion that it might still be there. Othek Val watched the human warship dissolve off his board and made no move to stop it. He could not have stopped it. He understood that now in his bones. But more than that, he did not want to. He had given his word, on the open channel, in front of 300 eyes, that if the killing stopped, the ship could go. The Concorde had built its whole 1100 years on the idea that a thing seen is a thing held. Othek had just learned, the hard way, that this was false. He was not going to compound the lesson by also learning that a thing promised could be broken. If the Concorde was going to survive what had happened today, it would have to become a people who kept their word to ghosts, because ghosts, it turned out, were real, and they were watching, and they remembered. Let her go, he said quietly, when a junior eye reached, by old reflex, to log a pursuit. Hands off the boards. She gave us back 7 ships and a tower and our lives. We gave her our word. We are going to keep it. He looked around the deep ring, at 300 young faces that had aged a year that morning. And we are going to spend a long time thinking about what we learned today, because if we file it wrong, the next ghost will not be so kind. The last ghost image of the hushed lantern faded from the watchtower's board, and then there was nothing, and the inner ring of Malrect was quiet and clean, and for the first time in 1100 years, afraid of its own dark. Aboard the lantern, the silence held for a long while as the watch world fell away behind them and the cold deep opened ahead. Brask did not order a burn until they were 4 hours out, past the last of the watch rings, into the open lanes where a quiet ship could finally be only quiet and not also a held breath. When the drive at last came up to a low, honest hum, several of the crew let out a sound that was half a laugh and half something else. The noise people make when they have held still for too long and are finally allowed to move. Corin Alt came up from the firing board, his big hands finally empty, and stood beside Brask's chair. 4 kills, he said. We meant for none. It was not a complaint. He had built half the ship's stealth with those hands, and he knew, as well as she did, that the moment the Concorde chose to fire, the 4 were the price of the 7 and the 31,000. But he was an honest man, and he had counted, and the count mattered to him. They chose it, Brask said. I gave them every chance not to. I came up speaking their own language, holding fire, asking. I told the Censor Prime it was his choice, and I meant it. She watched the dark ahead. He chose to strike the thing he couldn't measure, because that's what his people have always done. That's the wound at the heart of the Concorde. They are so afraid of the unmeasured that they kill it on sight. We just showed them the unmeasured can kill back. Maybe next time the fear teaches them to ask instead of fire. She was quiet a moment. 4 ships so that 31,000 people keep their orchards, and so the Concorde learns it can be reached. I'll carry the 4, but I won't call it a loss. Pel Idris, at her board, had been listening to the Concorde's own bands all the way out, reading the watchworld talk to itself in the wreckage of its certainty. She turned in her seat. You should hear what they're saying back there, she said. The whole tower's arguing. Half of them want it buried, called a censor fault, never spoken of again, but Othik won't let them. He's got the record open on every band. He keeps saying the same thing. She found the line and read it out, translating as she went. He says, a people who cannot be surprised is a people who has stopped looking. He says, we were never the great watchers we believed. We were only the watchers no one had bothered to fool. He says, file it true, all of it, so that our children grow up knowing the dark can hold a thing the eye cannot, and grow up humble enough to ask what it is, before they try to kill it. Pel looked up. He's turning the worst day of his life into a school lesson, for the whole Concorde. Brask was quiet for a long moment. Then it worked, she said. Better than I hoped. I came to scare them off Cantrell. I didn't think I'd change what kind of people they are. She almost smiled. An empire that learns to ask instead of fire is a quieter galaxy for everyone, including us. The hushed lantern turned for home. It was a long flight back, longer than the flight out, because there was no need to creep now, but Brask kept the ship quiet anyway, out of habit, and out of something deeper than habit. 41 people who had lived 9 years in silence did not shed it in a day. They moved soft, they spoke low, but the air aboard had changed. The held breath was gone. People laughed in the galley, quietly, the way you laugh when something that should have killed you didn't, and they slept the deep sleep of people who had carried a thing impossibly heavy all the way to the end of the road and set it down whole. On the 11th day of the flight home, a message reached the lantern through the quiet fleet's own dark channels, relayed and re-relayed across the long reach, and it was about Cantrell. The colony was alive. The orchards were under glass. The one tired city ran its one tired day. The orbital dock that had not seen a warship in living memory still had not seen one, and the 31,000 went about their small, poor lives with no idea at all that any of it had ever hung by a thread, or that the thread had held. There was a line in the message, added by some quiet fleet clerk who must have known where the lantern had been and what it had bought, and the line said only this: Cantrell sends no thanks, because Cantrell does not know. The quiet arm asks for nothing else. Brask read it twice, and then she folded it away, and she sat for a while in the dim heart of her quiet ship, thinking about a small world she would never see, that would never know her name, and she found that she did not mind at all. There were people in the galaxy who fought to be seen winning. The quiet arm fought so that no one would ever have to know there had been a fight. It was a strange way to be a soldier. It was, Brask had come to believe, the best way there was. Far behind her, on a watch world at the heart of an unbeaten empire, Sensor Prime Othik Val sat in his high chair in the small hours and looked at the dark. The screens still burned their soft blue across his old face. The board still showed him a galaxy filed and named and counted, 70 systems of contacts behaving exactly as their measurements promised. For 40 years that view had given him a deep, clean certainty, the certainty of a man who could not be surprised. The view was the same tonight. The certainty was gone, and it was never coming back, and Othik had decided, somewhere on the long shocked night of the day the ghost came, that he was glad. A people who cannot be surprised has stopped looking. He had said it to the deep ring, and he believed it more each hour. The Concorde had not been watching the dark for 1100 years. It had been admiring its own reflection in the glass, mistaking the limit of its sight for the limit of the universe, certain that the empty places on the board were empty and not merely unfooled. The humans, the loud ones, the species the watchtower had laughed at that very morning for being unable to whisper, had built a thing that was the shape of nothing in his eyes, and had walked it into his lap, and had held fire, and had asked him to choose, and he had chosen wrong, and they had spared him anyway, and told him to remember. He was going to remember. He was going to make the whole Concorde remember. Not the shape of the human ship, because they had never gotten the shape, and Othik had quietly let the hunt for it die, because a people who spend the next century trying to learn to see the unseeable would only be admiring the glass again, more desperately than before. No, he was going to make them remember the lesson under the ship, which was older and simpler and harder than any sensor craft. The dark holds more than the eye can find. Be humble before what you cannot measure. Ask before you fire. The thing you cannot see may be a singing rock. It may also be a warship that has been in your lap for 40 minutes, holding its fire, hoping you are wise. The eyes of Maelrekt had been afraid of the unmeasured for 1100 years, and that fear had made them kill it on sight, and the killing had made them proud, and the pride had made them blind. A single human ship had broken all four in a single morning. Fear, then killing, then pride, then blindness, unwound in 3 seconds when a singing rock dropped its coat and pointed a spinal mount at his home. Othik Val looked at the dark, and for the first time in 40 years he did not see a thing to be measured and ruled. He saw a thing too large for any eye, full of singing rocks and silent ships, and 1,000 things his tower had filed as empty that might not be empty at all, and he felt, instead of the old clean certainty, something he had not felt since he was a young eye learning his first board. He felt wonder. He felt small, and he found, to his surprise, that being small in front of something larger than your eyes was not the terror his people had built 1100 years of towers to escape. It was the beginning of actually looking. He had spent 40 years watching the dark and never once seeing it. He thought he might, in whatever years he had left, finally learn how. In the years that followed, the Concorde changed in ways its neighbors took a long time to understand, because the change did not look like the changes empires usually make. It did not build a bigger fleet. It did not hunt for the secret of the human ghost, though for a while a few proud eyes tried, and gave up, because Othik Val had been right, that chasing the unseeable was only a more frantic way of admiring the glass. It did not even stop expanding its watch net. What it stopped doing was wiping the smudges. The order that had stood over Cantrell, the calm, tidy order to clean a world for the crime of being hard to measure, was the last of its kind the Concorde ever wrote. The recall Othik logged that morning, with the line that the smudge was never a smudge, became a kind of scripture in the watchtowers, taught to every young eye on every world the Concorde watched. There are things in the dark the lens cannot pierce. Ask before you fire. The thing you cannot measure may be greater than you, and kinder than you deserve. The neighbors of the Concorde, peoples who had lived for generations in quiet terror of the all-seeing empire that cleaned worlds, noticed only that the cleanings had stopped, and did not know why, and made up their own reasons, none of them true. The truth lived in one watchtower, in one logged record that an old Sensor Prime had refused to let anyone clean, and in the soft-shoed silence of 41 people who came home and never spoke of where they had been. The galaxy grew a little gentler, and almost no one knew the reason was a singing rock that had dropped its coat over the heart of an empire and chosen, with its home in the crosshairs, not to fire. That was the quiet arm's whole trade. It bought mercy in places that would never know they had been bought, with a coin no one would ever see spent. Brask had made her peace with it long ago, and on the long flight home she made it again, gladly, the way you renew a vow you have come to love. The hushed lantern came home in the deep quiet, slipping into the quiet fleet's dark anchorage the same way she did everything, without a flare or a sound, a thing that was there and then was simply known to be there, in her own time, on her own terms. 41 people walked off her in soft shoes and did not speak of where they had been, because that was the way of the quiet arm, and most of them would never speak of it to anyone for the rest of their lives. Lena Brask was the last off, as a captain should be. She stood at the foot of her ship in the dim anchorage and looked up the long dark length of her. 90,000 tons of warship built to be the shape of nothing in the finest eyes in the reach, and she thought about a sensor prime 3 jumps away who would never measure her, and a colony 3 jumps the other way that would never thank her, and a galaxy that would never know how close one small poor world had come to being wiped from a lens for the crime of being a smudge. No one would ever make a song about the hushed lantern. The loud ships got the songs. The quiet arm got the silence, and the silence was the whole point, and Brask had made her peace with that a long time ago. The reward for doing the quietest work in the galaxy was that the galaxy stayed quiet, and the people you saved kept their orchards, and slept their ordinary sleep, and never once looked up afraid. That was enough. It had always been enough. She put her hand flat against the cold, dark hull of her ship, the way Corin Alt put his hands on the firing board, the way a person touches a thing they have trusted their life to and found worthy. "Good ship," she said, to no one, in the quiet. Then Lena Brask turned and walked out into the soft light of the anchorage, and behind her the hushed lantern settled into the dark to rest, and the dark held it, and kept it secret, the way the dark had always held the things the eyes could never quite find.